Welcome everyone this morning to this presentation of the APP's speaker series. The sponsor is the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, which is a organization of ordained and non-ordained men and women who act on their baptismal call to be priests and prophets. Our topic is the vision of Pope Francis and U.S. foreign economic policies, and our speaker is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University.
Thank you so much for that those wonderful words, that kind introduction, the beautiful prayer. I am indeed in Rome today, so close by the Vatican, not exactly there today, but across the Tiber from the Vatican, and I'll be hosting a meeting at the Vatican on November 6th and 7th about 2025 being a Jubilee year. Of course, Pope Francis has called next year the Jubilee year. I think that this is extremely important and inspiring, and I would like to see it be the Jubilee year of peace as the central message. And Pope Francis's message of peace is, as you say, astounding and incredibly important. I should say, of course, the Church has played a critical role in promoting world peace on many occasions. One that is absolutely important and notable to understand is 62 years ago, because it's relevant for us today. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis period, which was the closest that humanity ever came to nuclear war. We avoided it by a miracle, I would say, because we were within seconds, actually, of the firing of a nuclear torpedo by a Russian submarine, and one person countermanded that order and saved the world, because the U.S. nuclear doctrine at that time was that if we were attacked by any nuclear weapon of any kind, tactical or strategic, we would unleash the full force of our nuclear arsenal on the world and probably would have ended the world. Well, in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Pope John the 23rd played a very important role in helping to guide a kind of diplomacy or dialogue of peace between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And you will know that after the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, Pope John the 23rd was dying of cancer in 1963, but he said that he would use every last ounce of his energy to promote a safer world. And he issued in the spring of 1963 an encyclical, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, that was a message to both Kennedy and Khrushchev that statecraft, how nations behave with regard to each other, is a matter of moral law. It cannot just be viewed as the anarchy of international affairs or the rule of power. Statecraft has to be guided by moral principles. It's interesting that, of course, Kennedy received the Pope's encyclical with great interest, but so did Nikita Khrushchev. Indeed, he waited for it in his dacha because a Russian translation was hand-delivered to Khrushchev in the spring of 1963. And Kennedy and Khrushchev were inspired by the encyclical and redoubled their efforts to find a way back from the nuclear brink. And they did so in July 1963 by agreeing to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was then ratified overwhelmingly by the US Senate after President Kennedy made astounding efforts to explain why such an agreement was trustworthy and in the security interests of the United States, because after all, this was the height of the Cold War. And we don't have a president right now brave enough to negotiate with Russia or some of the other counterparts. I'm sorry to put it in those terms, but I think those terms are a little harsh, but justified, actually. President Kennedy was very brave, and he also told the American people how important peace was, and he was inspired by Pacem in Terris, as was Nikita Khrushchev. Well, Pope Francis has been telling us for more than a decade that we're already in World War III. I remember the first time I heard this a decade ago, and it was quite jarring to hear Pope Francis speak in those terms. It didn't seem like we were in World War III. It seemed like we had tensions, but Pope Francis has an extraordinary feel of our global predicament, and he intuited that we were on a path of increasing violence, on a path in which we were not solving our problems through diplomacy, on a path in which overt war of the major powers was becoming ever more likely. That was 10 years ago. I don't think anyone would doubt his words now. Now, he has issued two encyclicals that are absolutely stunning in their importance and in their inspiration. Laudato Si was the encyclical in 2015 that informed both the believers and the non-believers, as he put it, about our common fate on earth as nature is so profoundly threatened and degraded by wanton and reckless economic activity, by the way we use fossil fuels, by the way we pollute the planet, by the way we cut down the rainforests and drain the wetlands and so forth. And Laudato Si was a very important message that was received in the lead up to the Paris climate negotiations in December 2015, and it made a difference, I know. By the way, many people said, and some wrote to me also, what does Pope Francis know about climate change? How can he write such things? But I'll tell you one thing. First, he knows because he is very well trained in science, so he is fully aware of the issues. But the Vatican is absolutely astounding, I think unique among the world's major religions, because it has a Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and it has a Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. I happen to be fortunate to be an academician of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. But the Pontifical Academy of Sciences is the physical scientists, the physicists, the climatologists, the agronomists, the chemists. And there were several meetings in the Vatican of world-leading climate experts and energy experts that helped to inform Laudato Si. So it wasn't only a message of goodwill or general principles. It was a message that was deeply informed by the latest of climate science knowledge. Now, the second encyclical that Pope Francis has issued is the 2019 encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And it is really an encyclical about peace. And it's also, in my view, fundamentally important. First, let me say from what I hear from Pope Francis, as we all do, but over the last 10 years, for Pope Francis, the core of morality is the Beatitudes, is the Sermon on the Mount. This, I think, who can speak for Pope Francis, but my interpretation is that for Pope Francis, this is the core of Christian ethics, is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And of course, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." And I think that this is completely central in the Pope's vision, that above all, one could say, peace, because without peace, there can be nothing else. There can be no economy, there can be no escape from poverty, there can be no climate safety. Without peace, everything else is vanquished. And Fratelli Tutti, in my reading and interpretation, is in an encyclical about peace, just as Pacem in Terris was an encyclical about peace. But for Pope Francis, it's a special approach because it's both pastoral, but it's also methodological. How do you make peace? His main message is you encounter the other. His paradigmatic part of Laudato Si is the Good Samaritan. And that is the foundation text for his reflection about dialogue and about encountering the other, about crossing the road to help the other, about crossing the road to talk with the other, about giving your resources for the healing of the injured party so that they can recover from their injuries, giving the money to the inn, as the Good Samaritan did. And Pope Francis, unique, I'm sure, of all of the encyclicals in history, dedicates this encyclical to a Muslim theologian, to the Grand Imam of Al-Aqsa, because he and the Grand Imam of Al-Aqsa, which, as you know, is considered to be the highest center of learning of Sunni Islam. And the Grand Imam himself is a great scholar, a great academic, and a wonderful person. Pope Francis and the Grand Imam have come together on a number of occasions to promote the common cause of peace. And in dedicating Laudato Si to the Grand Imam, he recounts, because it was at that year the 800th anniversary of the unbelievable but true story of Francis of Assisi going by foot and by ship across the Mediterranean in the Fifth Crusade in 1219 to meet with the Sultan Al-Malik al-Kemal on the battlefield of the Fifth Crusade in Damietta, Egypt. You can't make this up. And St. Francis went to the battlefield and he appealed to the Muslim fighters who were in battle against the Christians, crusaders, to let him pass and to meet with the Sultan. And the Sultan gave his approval, and in 1219 they stayed up all night in a discussion of religion and ethics and war. And as is often true of peacemakers, St. Francis's effort did not succeed in making the peace of the Fifth Crusade. The war continued, but St. Francis stayed alive. He was able to return to Assisi, and we recall 805 years afterwards, right now, this peacemaking mission of St. Francis. And this also is the the text of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti. So what he's telling us is, above all, encounter the other. And in practical terms, what he's saying is negotiate. And this, to my mind, is the single most important factor in making peace today. And it's the greatest failing of our administration. It's the greatest failing of the way U.S. foreign policy is conducted. President Biden has not spoken to President Putin one time since February 2022, though a war is raging that could easily escalate to nuclear war. And indeed, the way that it is heatedly, publicly disputed and discussed is filled with provocations and vindictiveness and hate talk on both sides that could easily get out of hand. The idea to humiliate the other side rather than to sit down and negotiate. So I watch foreign policy very closely. I participate in diplomacy intensively, though usually economic diplomacy, not security diplomacy. But I can tell you how shocked I am by the failure of negotiation. There is none. We're not negotiating. A couple of weeks ago at the United Nations General Assembly, when the world leaders come, I had the chance to sit down with the president of Iran. The president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, is a heart surgeon. He's a very soft-spoken man. He came with a message of peace. He came to the UN with the message of peace. I heard it with my own ears. He spoke beautifully. It was completely ignored by the United States. Did President Biden try to meet with him? No. Did President Biden try to meet with the Iranian foreign minister? No. No attempt at all. And then the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, who is a man of war, not a man of peace. He's been promoting war for 30 years. He talked hate about Iran. He didn't even try to meet the counterpart. You could meet and it can fail, but he didn't even try to meet. He didn't even try to respond to words of peace by the president of Iran. He just spouted hatred. Iran is out to destroy us. Not something that he knows from face to face or that he tried to overcome through diplomacy or through explanation. No, just to say we must unite to defeat the other country. And he didn't mean defeat diplomatically. He meant to defeat by war. Well, every hour now we're on the knife edge. Israel's going to attack Iran. Where, how, what will Iran do? What will the United States do? Will it escalate into war? And they don't talk to the other side. They don't even try to find out. And Pope Francis's message is talk, dialogue, encounter, even, God forbid, respect, so that you hear the other side, so that you hear the concerns. I have been following the situation in Ukraine for decades. I was an advisor to one of Ukraine's presidents, President Kuchma, in 1994. I was an advisor to President Gorbachev. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin. They wanted peace. We did not. We wanted to win the Cold War. We wanted Russia to do what we demanded. We wanted to expand the U.S. military everywhere. We wanted to push NATO and U.S. missile systems right up against Russia's borders, something we would never tolerate ourselves in our own hemisphere. And when the Soviet Union tried to do so, we nearly had World War III. But we say to the others, we do what we want. We're the United States. And this ended up with war. Now, I listen to the Russian side all the time. They make very good points. We don't want NATO on our borders. We don't want our your missile systems on our borders. We don't like how the United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We don't like how the United States unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. We don't like how the United States unilaterally abandoned the Open Skies Treaty. We don't like how the United States walked away from the treaty with Iran, the so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Agreement. So they have lots of good points. We don't discuss those. We think it's beneath our power to have such a discussion. But Pope Francis's message is make peace. And by the way, a peacemaker means that peace isn't just a natural state of things, it has to be made. And you make it actively, not passively. It's not the absence of war, it is the presence of peace, which is based on trust, it's based on dialogue, it's based on reciprocity, it's based on fairness, and that is peacemaking. And we're not even trying to do that right now. So this is, to my view, Pope Francis's message. He has called for negotiations. Every time he does, he's attacked by the United States and others as, oh, you're just speaking Putin's line. That's not true. Peace isn't about Putin's line. Peace is for all of us. And especially given that Russia and the US each have 6,000 nuclear warheads, we better find a way to dialogue and away from this kind of escalating confrontation. That's the Pope's wisdom. It's the most important wisdom on the planet. Let me stop there and turn it over to you so we can have some discussion.
Dr. Sachs, thank you very, very much for your insights. And obviously, it flows from a wealth of experience and a wealth of study. So we really appreciate that. So, Joyce, I see your hands up. Why don't you share your question or comment?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs. My question is, what role do we, members of a Catholic community in the United States, have in hearing your message and hearing the message of Pope Francis in the documents, have in trying to influence, I would say, our own leadership, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops? I know that our bishops spoke out. I think it was in the 80s. We had some great people like Bishop Gumbleton, who were able to make their voices heard and be people of influence. How do you see, what can we do? And then how do you see the Catholic leadership in the United States at this time?
Yeah, that's a wonderful thought, by the way, to get the bishops to come forward with a positive peace initiative. Our politicians are a little bit lost right now. Which politicians speaking peace? We don't have it. We must face down Putin. Yes, but they don't understand. We must negotiate with Putin also. And if they knew more than they do, or if they knew more than they pretend to know, they'd also know that Russia has some very, very legitimate concerns. And saying that doesn't make you anti-American. It just makes you speak the truth. So I think the idea of the bishops making some kind of statement, especially maybe just after the election, calling on the incoming government to take an approach to step away from the nuclear threat, which is dire and getting closer and closer, and to actually negotiate is really an important, superb idea. And so I'd like to follow up with you on that, and would encourage your group to try to push for that. I know a lot of the details of the events, the history, how we got into this mess. So I'm also absolutely available at a technical level to continue the discussion. Our politicians need to know that the American people want peace, and they're not afraid of negotiations. And I always refer back to President Kennedy's inaugural address in January 20th, 1961, when he said, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." And this is exactly the right approach. And if we actually did that, we'd have peace. Because if you sit down with the Russians, for example, as I do frequently, they have a good case and they have a very practical way to end this war. If the United States were to sit down with Iran, they would be shocked, because I hear directly from Iranian senior officials, they want peace. They will sign up to the two-state solution, giving Israel its security, as long as there's a state of Palestine with security for the Palestinians, which is the solution that I think is absolutely the necessary solution. So in this sense, there really is hope, because the ways to end these wars is not so bewildering, not so mysterious. It's actually quite straightforward. But we don't want to hear about that, it seems. The American military state became so arrogant, and it really did, that we don't have to listen to anyone. We're the most powerful country in the world. We do as we please. And this is the attitude that absolutely needs to be overcome.
Thank you. Sister Barbara, you had your hand up, and then we have a question from Jim McCarville. Sister Barbara.
Yes, Jeffrey, I really appreciate your challenge about, and I agree that our top leadership should be negotiating. However, the complexity of it, for instance, yeah, if you have a person like Trump who says to Putin, you can do whatever you want, he really didn't sit down and negotiate. So, so that dynamic. So, how do we get past that kind of dynamic, but still encourage our leadership to sit down at the table?
I think it's what we should do is understand what a sound, real solution would be. And I, right now, I'm not too happy with any of the politics in our country. I'm not too happy with either of the candidates, I have to tell you. I am just trying to get to answers, no matter who is elected, to say this is the way that American security and global security can be achieved. And each situation, therefore, requires some specificity. So I'm saying sit at the table because I know also what the discussion would be at the table. Let me give you very quickly there are three places where war could be devastating right now. One is Ukraine, one is the Middle East, and one is with China. And it's three particular issues that need to be resolved through negotiation. The reason we're at war with Ukraine actually is the United States started to push NATO up to Russia's border. And Russia views that just like the United States views intrusions in the Western Hemisphere as a threat. And we should be saying to Russia, you stop the fight, stop fighting, leave Ukraine alone, but Ukraine will be neutral and we won't put our military bases there. Russia would say, oh, we've had a great victory. The U.S. has agreed finally not to put its military there. The United States could say, oh, we've had a great victory. Ukraine is no longer being bombed by Russia. That's actually within reach, but we haven't tried it. Literally, we haven't tried it. I begged the White House, stop the NATO enlargement in return for peace. They said, no, 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 it's our principle. NATO can go where it wants. Russia has no say. I said, are you kidding? We would never accept that from our point of view. Well, you know, this is the lack of reciprocity, or the lack of the golden rule, basically. We can't think of how we treat others as we would want them to treat us. And so this is that core problem. What's the core problem in the Middle East? Well, really, it comes down to the need for two states and some peacekeepers in between them, no doubt. But the need for two states so that there's security for both peoples. And the United States even says this, but it doesn't mean it when it says it, because Israel has been opposed to a Palestinian state. They want to bludgeon their way to security by defeating everyone around them, rather than by diplomacy of getting the other side to agree to Israel's security in return for Palestinian security. So that war actually has a pretty straightforward solution, though Israel has rejected it until now. In East Asia, the great threat is Taiwan. Actually, it's US policy that Taiwan is part of China. It is, from many, many points of view, legal, geopolitical, and historical. But the US is playing games with its one China policy. And there are many in Taiwan that want independence, and the Chinese are saying, we're one China. And when the government in Taiwan was first established in 1949, they said, yes, it's one China. We run China from Taiwan. Beijing said, we run China from Beijing. Of course, in the Civil War, the Beijing side won the Civil War, but both sides had agreed there's one China. Now the United States is playing games, saying, we're going to send armaments to Taiwan, whether China likes it or not. But this would be like China saying, we're going to send armaments to New York State, whether Washington agrees or not. It would be unheard of. No foreign power can send armaments to a US state when the federal government objects, but that's exactly what we're doing in China. To my mind, it's another violation of the Golden Rule. If we were to follow the Golden Rule, we would have peace. And so these are complicated issues because each circumstance has its own reality. But it's not to tell them, go do whatever you want. It's to say, have a solution that is consistent with international law, consistent with mutual respect, consistent with reciprocity, and through negotiation, not on the battlefield.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. We have a question in the chat from Jim McCarville. He wants to know, is there anything that can be done before the election? It seems like pursuing peace is being perceived as a loser, and so it's not an active part of the dialogue or the campaign. And if nothing before, is there something that can be done post-election? Dr. Sachs?
Yes. So it's terrible, this election campaign. On the one side, both Harris and Trump are aggressively anti-China and aggressively pro-Israel, and neither has said a word about negotiation. When it comes to Ukraine, Trump has said more or less the right thing, which is that he knows that NATO is a provocation and that he would call Putin and stop the war. Harris has said that she will continue the current policy, which is a policy of supporting war, unfortunately, because our official policy is that we will give Ukraine as much and as long as it takes to defeat Russia, which is never going to happen. So it's a recipe for open-ended war and open-ended slaughter and open-ended danger of nuclear escalation. So Trump actually does a little bit better on Ukraine. They're both terrible, in my opinion, when it comes to the Israel question and when it comes to the China question, because they think that being bombastic, nasty, harsh is somehow vote getting. I don't believe it. I think if there were really a candidate for peace, they'd run away with success in this election. So that's my own modest advice. But I do think as much as we can do now to say to the candidates, we do not want war. We do not want escalation. We do not want these wars continuing. We do not want a war with China over Taiwan, is extremely important. They need to hear it no matter what effect it has. And then as soon as the election's over, I think that we really should be pushing through the Conference of Bishops, through other means, a peace approach.
Okay, Bob Stewart has his hand raised.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
I do.
Yeah. The bishops wrote a pastoral letter in 1983, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. And you think that would be worth dusting off and asking for an update from the U.S. Catholic bishops?
I do. I'm going to read it as soon as we finish, because I haven't read it in a long, long time. But that's a good precedent, and it is so timely, and it is completely in line with Pope Francis, what he's urging. And I think it could be part of the Jubilee year.
Thank you. We have a question from Marcia. Wanted to know, could you comment on the U.S. campus Palestinian rights protests and the weaponization of the term anti-Semitism?
Yes, to my mind, our students were very brave in protesting Israel's behavior. I don't think it's a matter of anti-Semitism or Semitism. I happen to be Jewish, and I'm aghast at what Israel is doing. How can you kill tens of thousands of people, bombing residential areas in cold blood? I think it's cold-blooded murder myself. I'm not anti-Semitic to say it. I am anti-Netanyahu. He always has wanted war for as long as he's been leader of Israel. He doesn't want negotiations. He doesn't want a Palestinian state. He doesn't want political justice for the Palestinians. He wants to win. That's actually what he said at the podium of the UN. We'll win. Oh, anyone who says that at the podium of the UN doesn't get it. The idea of the UN is not to win. The idea of the UN is to peacefully coexist on this planet. And so he misunderstands entirely. Now, this is what our students were saying, and they were Jewish students and Muslim students and Christian students. And what did Congress say right away? Arrest those students. That's terrible. And what did my university's administration do right away? It put the police on them. Absolutely unacceptable. And the president of the university that did that lost her job, and or she resigned, technically, a few weeks ago. But I could tell you, the moment the police went in, I said to my wife, "Okay, she's not going to remain as president of the university. You can't. Your responsibility is to your students, to your colleagues, to your faculty, and putting the police on them. My God." Don't do that. This is the last thing that you should ever do. Of course, if there's tremendous violence, that's one thing, but there was no violence. They were camping out on the lawn. That's not anti-Semitism, but it has been weaponized. And I am very dismayed about what Israel is doing, and maybe I don't think especially dismayed because I'm Jewish, but being Jewish doesn't stop me from being dismayed in any way. It probably personally for me accentuates it because this is not the values that we need. This is not the values that I was raised with. The values that I was raised with, there's an expression, pekuach nefesh, in Hebrew, meaning to save a soul. And one of the first things I was taught was the Jewish proverb that to save a soul is to save the universe. Well, that's a little bit different from bombing 2 million people in Gaza. Completely different. It's different from making hate speech at the podium of the UN. So this idea that this is anti-Semitism is wrong factually, and it's provocative because it's really trying to shut down protests. It happens to be shutting down protests of people who are on the correct side of this issue. They're on the side of life and they're on the side of justice. And that's extremely important.
So we have a number of questions in the chat that relate to the Russian-Ukraine situation. So, as you said, Trump seems to be, at least his rhetoric, is openness to some negotiation. Is that trustworthy rhetoric? You talked about the U.S. and Russia. What's the role of Ukraine itself in the negotiations? And if Russia does take over Ukraine, haven't they just pushed their borders up to NATO anyways?
Yeah. So they will not take over Ukraine. Their claim is over roughly 20% in the eastern and southern margin, because that's especially the eastern side, is ethnically Russian. And what the Russians say, and we should understand this at least, even if we don't agree with all of it, what the Russians say is, we didn't want any territory at all, and we didn't claim any territory at all during all of the period after independence of Ukraine in 1991, but we wanted the Russian people to be able to use their language, practice their religion, and live in peace. And what happened, and this is a long story, we don't have time to go into it right now, but in 2014, there was a violent coup that overthrew a government that wanted neutrality. And it was a government that was supported across the country by both ethnically Russian and ethnically Ukrainian parts of the country. But that government was overthrown by a radical nationalist part of Ukraine with the United States' help. The United States helped a violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government in February 2014, which is why the war started. Why did the US do that? Because we didn't want a neutral Ukraine. We wanted NATO Ukraine. And so this was conniving on the US side. But even after that violent overthrow, Russia did not say, well, we're going to take territory of Ukraine. Russia said, we don't accept the coup, but there must not be a crackdown of Russian people in Ukraine, ethnically Russian people, on the language, on the Russian Orthodox Church, on Russian culture. And a treaty was negotiated, actually, between Ukraine and Kiev and the two regions in eastern Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk, which had broken away after the coup. And the treaty was called the Minsk Agreement. And it said that the country remains together. Ukraine, of course, remains sovereign over these two districts, but these two districts, which are ethnically Russian, should have autonomy with rights for the Russian Orthodox Church, for the Russian language, and so on. And I know, and you'd be surprised, well, maybe not, but if you know the circumstances, the United States told the Ukrainians after they signed, you don't have to implement that. They really told them that. And since the Ukrainian government was a rather radical, right-wing, nationalist, anti-Russian government, they said, okay, we signed the treaty, but we're not going to implement it. And so the Russian claims of territory came only in 2022 after every other resort, neutrality, a coup, a failure of a treaty had come. The Russians have a point that the United States tricked them repeatedly. They signed agreements, they were tricked. U.S. said no NATO enlargement. They cheated on that, which they absolutely did. The U.S. participated in a coup to overthrow a government. The U.S. armed this coup government to go attack these ethnically Russian republics. The U.S. told Kyiv, you don't have to abide by the Minsk II agreement, even though you signed it and even though the UN Security Council agreed to it. So this is not a carte blanche for Putin to take over Ukraine. It's the opposite. It's to say, we know the roots of this. The roots of this are the United States never listened to you, engaged in a coup, behaved badly, encouraged Ukraine to break treaties. We have to do better if we're going to restore peace. And that would be the basis for being at the negotiating table. Will Trump get this right? Will Harris get this right? Who knows? I'm not thrilled with the quality of political candidates or leadership right now, to say the least. But what I do think we can do, and what I try to do, is put forward the facts and the practical ways forward, and hope that someone is listening. I'm going to have to stop at this point because I have to run to another meeting here, and I would be very happy to continue. I think your idea of connecting with the bishops is a wonderful idea, very important. It could really make a difference, and if I can be helpful in that way, any kind of briefing or background, I will be absolutely honored to do so.
Well, Dr. Sachs, thanks very much for your time this morning. We appreciate it. We know how busy your schedule is and how many demands there are on your time. So thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
And for all of you.
And success in your ongoing academic and diplomatic efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
So it's 11:30. We were scheduled to go to noon. Obviously, we lost our presenter, so we can't ask him any questions. But I saw, Michael, you had your hand raised. Was it a question, Michael, or a comment that you would like to make in response to what you heard?
Yeah, it was rather a question for Jeffrey Sachs, so it is redundant, I guess.
Okay.
But while I have the floor, just to say how wonderful he was and how enlightening it was, and that I want to follow up on what I said in the introduction, that his blog. I wanted to give you to give the participants the email through which they can get this periodic blog, which he sends out. I think he sends it out like weekly, and it comes from Sonia Sachs, whom I presume is his spouse. And it comes Sachs, SSACHS, at ei.columbia.edu. That if you email her, you would be put on the list to receive his weekly, very incisive comments on current economic and political events here and in the world.
Well, thanks for that resource. We appreciate that. And